BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays, I talk to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And in this episode, I will be revisiting George Chapman as a Jack the Ripper suspect, as well as looking at his possible involvement in the Thames Torso Murders. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. Firstly, I would like to give a big thank you to everyone who listened to last week's episode on the murder of Elizabeth Jackson, who was a victim from the Thames Torso Murders. And in this episode, I'm going to pick up where last week's episode left off, because I told you guys that there's a book out there called The Thames Torso Murders of Victorian London by R. Michael Gordon, and his suspect is named George Chapman for both Jack the Ripper and the Thames Torso murder mysteries. George Chapman is a suspect that I've discussed before on Ripper Wednesday, and I have a very general suspect profile episode that is available in the suspect playlist here on Black Box Online Radio. So to do a very basic recap, I'm just going to tell you what I know and remember about George Chapman as a Jack the Ripper suspect, and then we will look at some of these possible connections to the Thames Torso murders, as well as a general overview of those murders as well. Firstly, George Chapman was born in 1865 in Poland in Eastern Europe, and he may have spent time in Russia as well. He was someone who was born under the name of Severin Klasovsky in 1865, meaning that he would have been around 23 years old at the time of the murders of Jack the Ripper in 1888. At the time of the Autumn of Terror, I should say, he would be 23 years old. He also had education in surgery, and he was a barber surgeon, which is something that was rather commonplace at the time. Somebody could have had education in surgery to a certain extent. If someone were a barber surgeon, it sounds like they wouldn't be on par with the royal surgeon, but they would know a lot about anatomy, they would know basic elements of surgery, and they would also have a very strong medical education. Then George Chapman takes his exams under the name of Severin Klasovsky in Poland. Then he flees to England, and some people question why he did this, because he takes the exams and then he goes to England and he starts living under an alias. He's actually using the name Ludwig for a while, and then ultimately changes his name to George Chapman later on after he's already established in England. Some people think it's because he got a woman pregnant and she started following him, or she began looking to him for some type of connection. But he goes to England, and he's in England at the time of the Whitechapel murders. And George Chapman is also a suspect that was thought to be very highly regarded by Frederick George Aberline, an inspector who has a very big reputation in this case. And furthermore, George Chapman went on to become a real serial killer, and he was known as the Borough poisoner. Those are just some things off the top of my head. But what I would like to do is actually say that over the last 12 months, I've actually considered George Chapman more strongly as a Jack the Ripper suspect. When I did my first episode, not only was it extremely general, it was also one where you could hear a lot of skepticism coming from me. And I'm not going to lie to you guys. When I first heard that George Chapman, aka Severin Klasovsky, was a Jack the Ripper suspect, I took a very brief look at the profile and I was like, okay, I can see where people are coming from. Medical education, he was a real serial killer, but he was a poisoner. Moreover, he specifically targeted his wives. George Chapman was ultimately hanged. He was hanged for the murders of his 3 wives, and he's targeting people who have specific connections to him. He was also committing the crimes by poisonings, which is so different than the vicious Ripper who cut women's bodies apart, cutting out their organs like the uterus and the kidney and the heart, leaving the women's bodies mutilated and disemboweled in the streets. a poisoner is a very different type of murderer. One reason why I began to have a big reversal about George Chapman and to think more highly of him was actually because of Dr. Lee Meller, who was a co-host of the Citizen Detective podcast. Dr. Lee Meller is a criminologist, and he has a lot of very good insights. In short, I can understand his evaluations, but I also respect his opinions, and I can tell that it's coming from a place of experience. And also, he laid out the story on the Citizen Detective podcast where he had the exact same feelings and experiences that I did. He thought, this suspect is implausible. There's no way that a poisoner is going to go on to become Jack the Ripper. But through his criminological education, he learned that sometimes different crimes are committed for different reasons. And also, one thing that I did say in my previous episode on George Chapman is Jack the Ripper committed his final crime, the murder of Mary Kelly, on November 9th of 1888. Then, he was left perhaps with a very different state of mind. The killer maybe spent 2 hours with Mary Kelly, mutilating her body, cutting her apart, as previously stated, taking out her heart, and keeping that as a trophy. Perhaps somebody experienced a type of mental shift where nothing could overtake that type of stimulation. Perhaps there was no greater accomplishment that someone could do in terms of a disemboweling fantasy, as disgusting as it sounds, but the killer then thought that he was going to commit the crimes in a different way. So I can see how George Chapman is a more reasonable suspect. Now, I wouldn't say that he's my top Jack the Ripper suspect, but he's definitely one that is going to be discussed by R. Michael Gordon, and he's also the subject of this book here that is also on the Thames Torso Killers. If George Chapman was Jack the Ripper, the Thames Torso Killer, and the Borough Poisoner, he would be one of the most evil men in history, and definitely one of the most vile and vicious men in history. Right now, I would like to just do a very basic walkthrough of this book here, The Thames Torso Murders of Victorian London. And that is that during a central 13-week period, working in a single square mile of London, centered on Whitechapel, the Ripper murdered 6 local prostitutes, mutilating most as he searched for body parts. The names of Martha Tabram, Annie Chapman, Mary Jane Kelly, and others have become well known to Ripperologists. So it sounds like R. Michael Gordon is also going to be accusing George Chapman of the murder of Martha Tabram, and I have a couple episodes that I've done recently for Ripper Wednesday where I've looked at the possibility of her being a genuine victim. But yes, those are the names he lists off. Martha Tabram, Annie Chapman, and Mary Jane Kelly are known well to Ripperologists and casual readers alike. Few, however, remember the name Elizabeth Jackson, who died during the second series of murders in Old London. And this is something that just shocked me, and maybe this is one of the reasons why I wanted to make the episode in this particular way, because just last week I did my episode on the murder of Elizabeth Jackson. Not exactly for this reason, because I thought that she was forgotten. In fact, I don't think that she's forgotten. Elizabeth Jackson is the only victim of the Thames Torso Killer who has been properly identified. And this is also a very big misconception that I think people have about Victorian England, and that is that people are forgotten, that the victims of Jack the Ripper, and as we see the Thames Torso Killer, have been forgotten. But what I find to be very strange and almost alarming is that he lists off the names of Jack the Ripper's victims, and he lists Martha Tabram, Annie Chapman, and Mary Jane Kelly. Well, those are only 3 of the names. Why would he do that if he wants to be respectful? And he says that Jack the Ripper murdered 6 local women, yet he only lists 3 of their names, and then says few people remember Elizabeth Jackson? Well, if you're talking about remembrance, why don't you also say the names of the other victims, like Polly Nichols and Catherine Eddowes and Liz Stride? So, it's almost just like picking and choosing. But I have an entire episode on the Forgotten 5 women because my honest answer is I do not believe that the women who were killed by Jack the Ripper and even Elizabeth Jackson have been forgotten. And we're still talking about her here on Ripper Wednesday. And truly, truly, rest in peace to Elizabeth Jackson. And I'll say some follow-ups about my episode from last week at the end, so please stay tuned. A dramatic name was given in the killings to the Ripper, and a series by an inflammatory press, or the closeness of the killings in time and place, or even perhaps the fact that no one was ever charged with those murders is what keeps the series in the minds of many. Whatever the reason, the fact remains is that this is the case which seems to overshadow all others. It has even overshadowed one series which began before the Ripper series and lasted longer, but it was just as brutal in all respects as any Ripper murder that ever was. That series of murders would collectively be called the Thames Torso Murders or the Thames Dismemberment Murders. And like the Ripper murders, it would occur for the most part in the East End of London, targeting local prostitutes. The series began in 1887, fully 1 year before Jack began his work. There would be a second in 1888 during the Central Ripper series, two in 1889 as the Ripper was slowing down, and then a long pause before the final torso in 1902. And despite many similarities in the Ripper and Torso murders, very few are willing to make a point that a single assassin is the prime suspect in both sets of crimes could be one and the same. In fact, it was the official policy view to view these crimes as fully separate events, unlinked to any one killer, and certainly not to the Ripper. Yet there were similarities. Okay, I'm going to stop right there because I actually think that these are some really good points. And firstly, I told you that I was going into this with an open mind. And with that, what that means is looking at the possibility of George Chapman being Jack the Ripper, the Thames Torso Killer, and the Borough Poisoner. Think about everything that I said at the beginning. Sometimes a person is going to commit different crimes for different reasons. And there are very strong similarities between the Thames Torso Killer and Jack the Ripper. In fact, I think that there are more similarities between the Thames Torso Killer and the Ripper than there are between Jack the Ripper and the Borough Poisoner. Because, as I said, poisonings versus a very hands-on and physical crime. The biggest difference between the Thames Torso murders and the Ripper crimes is that the Ripper didn't handle the bodies of the victims post-mortem extensively, maybe handling their organs post-mortem, but it's very apparent that the Thames Torso Killer cut off arms and legs and midsections of the women, as well as decapitating them, cutting their arms apart into smaller pieces, and Elizabeth Jackson was actually identified by her mother because of a specific scar that was on a portion of her arm. Absolutely terrible. But then the Thames Torso Killer transports the victims to different places, and some of them were not even in the Thames, like the Pinchin Street torso. So I think that this really goes to show that there are similarities, but there are a whole lot of differences. And I also want to share something else with you guys, because, he's talking about why is the Thames Torso Killer less popular than Jack the Ripper? Is it because of the trade name? Is it because of what has just been laid out, that the authorities were trying to keep distance between the investigations? Did the authorities dismiss the possibility too quickly that the Thames Torso Killer and Jack the Ripper could be the same person? My honest answer is, again, just going off of personal experience from doing this Ripper Wednesday segment, is that I first looked at the Thames Torso Killer and I didn't know what to say. I was like, I'm exploring this content for Black Box Online Radio, and I wanted to do an episode on the Thames Torso Killer back in 2023, but I had no idea what to say. I was like, this is so confusing. You have the crimes at 1887, 1888, 1889, 1901, and of course I wanted to look at some things in relation to Jack the Ripper and Ripper-style parallels. I'm not joking. I genuinely read information about the Thames Torso Killer, and I was just left speechless. So I think it's a very hard narrative for people to comprehend, and I do not say that lightly. Let's go back to the book. Yet there were similarities, such as the skills required, many of the wounds, the geographic area covered by the killer, the time frame, and of course, the selected victims, which do suggest that a closer inspection of these cases may very well show a connection. Serial killers do indeed change their killing styles and situations sometimes, and it dictates events not accounted for in the murder plans. Yeah, okay, that's everything that Dr. Lee Miller said. People commit different crimes for different reasons. A mutilator like Jack the Ripper could go on to become the Borough Poisoner, and a mutilator and disemboweler could become a dismembering serial killer like the Thames Torso Killer, and then become the Borough poisoner. As I said, I'm approaching this one with an open mind. On to the next sentence here. One such individual who changed his murder plans is the Zodiac Killer in California, who changed his techniques so many times that some of his murders may have even looked like accidents. Alright, I have to stop right there. The Zodiac changed his killing style so many times that some murders may look like accidents. Not exactly. I think you guys who follow my Zodiac Killer episodes know exactly what this person is talking about. And that is that the Zodiac Killer threatened to change the way that he was committing crimes. He said, I will no longer announce my collecting of slaves. I will no longer announce my crimes because it will slow down my collecting of slaves. Because the Zodiac said in multiple correspondences that the reason why he was committing murders was he wanted to have slaves in the afterlife. He wanted to die and be reborn in paradise. And the people that he killed on Earth would be his slaves in the afterlife. And he says, I will disguise my crimes as routine robberies and accidents. He said this after the murder of Paul Stein. So, what exactly would be the crime that the Zodiac disguised as an accident? I mean, he threatened to do that, but we don't actually know if he fulfilled that threatening promise. So, let's keep going here. The Zodiac Killer changed his technique so many times that his murders may have even looked like accidents. Serial killers do experiment with death. It is, after all, what they do best, and some go on for years. I mostly agree with that. And, I mean, serial killers can change the way they commit crimes. There can also be some type of unknown reason why they change the way that they commit crimes. For example, the Long Island serial killer, who is Rex Heuermann, allegedly, he is one who started out by mutilating the victims from 1993 all the way to perhaps 2007, including Cherry's Jane Doe. And then in 2007, he started strangling the victims. There can be countless reasons why different crimes are committed for different reasons. I mean, it can be something where the killer is doing this because of practicality. There may have been a very practical reason that the Long Island serial killer changed his MO. Or it could be what R. Michael Gordon is saying here, that this is a type of experimentation. Let's keep going with the book here. Was this Torso series just one more manifestation of a madman who changed seemingly at will, or an entirely different killer? Or was there some type of crossover? The question is asked, just how many sexual serial killers were working in London's East End in the late 1880s? And I do agree that both the Thames Torso Killer and Jack the Ripper were sexual serial killers. They're not actually having physical relations with the victims, to the best of our knowledge. But I do think that they got some type of stimulation from committing these crimes. Now, how many killers are operating in England in the late 1880s? I don't think that there's anything abnormal about the demographics of London and how two killers could be operating, two serial killers operating in a large metropolitan city. If you were to talk to me about that with any city of the same size population that London had in 1888, and there were two serial killers in there, I wouldn't be surprised at all. Even if we go back to the Zodiac Killer, and I'm bringing this up as I talk about the Zodiac Killer every Monday here on BBOR, Zodiac Monday, in San Francisco, there were so many other criminals operating. That's why people sometimes confuse the crimes. There was even San Francisco's Jack the Ripper, who murdered perhaps 3 people, including the murder of Jacqueline Truss in 1970, who was murdered by rope, by knife, by gun, and by fire. Then, shortly after she was murdered, a card was mailed in from the Zodiac Killer that said by rope, by knife, by gun, by fire. So this could even be how the Zodiac is trying to steal other people's thunder, even if he's not taking credit for the crimes. And ultimately, the murder of Jacqueline Truss was connected to a serial killer who was also convicted for 2 different murders, but not a lot of information has been made available to the public. But when it was put into the paper, it was referred to as San Francisco's Jack the Ripper and a Jack the Ripper style homicide. So it's entirely possible for any major metropolitan city to have two killers operating. Furthermore, with Northern California, we have the Zodiac in 1968 and 69. Then we have the Santa Rosa hitchhiker slayings in 1971 and so on. Who knows how long those went on. So you have very close proximity of serial killers operating. We're talking about one starts one year and another starts the other year. One concludes one year and then a different person starts committing serial homicides the next year. These types of events are not abnormal, so we should never jump to the conclusion that immediately these two have to be the same killer. And I think you guys can hear a little bit of passion coming out, because that was my ultimate observation. Once I was able to comprehend the Thames Torso killer to a certain extent, I was like, these seem like very different crimes, and I am not surprised at all if it turns out that they were two different killers. But let's keep going back to the writings of R. Michael Gordon. If police theories at the time were correct, there were several, but this was a real working theory or public propaganda being used by a hard-pressed police force trying to desperately control. And where were these murders, or were they something else? I'm really glad he asked that question. Were they murders, or were they something else? Because let's think about possibilities with the Thames Torso killer. I mean, could something else have happened? Could somebody have been doing experiments on women and they passed away? That might even constitute as murder. But what if this isn't some type of sexual pervert who enjoys mutilating the bodies of women? What if the Thames Torso killer was some type of, again, doctor who had patients die because he was doing very unethical things to them and he's trying to hide the bodies? What if something like that was present? Again, we can keep an open mind to certain possibilities. Even those who felt that they must write to the authorities and sign the name Jack the Ripper seemed unwilling to accept that the Ripper was responsible for the Torso murders, as witnessed by one writer of a Ripper letter. One writer of a Ripper letter. Lots of R's in that sentence, excuse me. No one wanted to take credit for these murders. In the name of God, hear me, I swear I did not kill the female whose body was found at Whitehall. No one ever wrote to the police claiming credit for the Torso murders. At least none are found in the complete files located in the public record. One reason why the Torso murders may have been officially downplayed can be seen in the geography of the two cases. In the Ripper series, the women lived in an area of about 300 square yards. For the most part, they were killed in an area of roughly 1 square mile. In the Torso series, the victims were mostly unknown and could have come from any area of London, and the killing zone could have been at least 20 square miles. No police force in the world then or now could cover the possible area in the Torso series. Very confusing. It's very confusing. I mean, with Jack the Ripper, some people think that, oh, well, this means that he was a resident of Whitechapel. You just heard that. A very small area, 1 square mile, 300 yards. But overall, I mean, I do not jump to that conclusion about the Ripper, actually. And let's just throw this out as a challenge question. Do you believe that Jack the Ripper was a resident of Whitechapel? Because there are some people who just immediately just slap their seal of approval on that. They're like, Jack the Ripper had to have lived in Whitechapel because of the geography, because all the victims are committed in such a small radius. I'm not convinced of that at all. That goes into the category of something that should be called a strong possibility. If it turns out that Jack the Ripper lived outside of that radius, I'm not going to be surprised either. I mean, both I think are reasonable possibilities. Either somebody committed the crimes where they lived, or they came to Whitechapel to commit the crimes, and then they left because they wanted an exit strategy. Both are plausible and both are feasible, in my opinion, but I would love to know what you think. Furthermore, with the Thames Torso killer, this is perhaps another reason why this case has received less attention than that of Jack the Ripper, and that is because it just shows that it is more complex. You're dealing with a bigger area, a bigger time frame, 1887 to 1902, and there isn't a lot of information about the victims. Only one of them has been identified, Elizabeth Jackson. You'll find just monikers or the names of the locations have been attributed to the other victims. So there really is just not a lot of information that we can use to connect to in regards to the victims. And I'm so glad he brought up the possibility that there could be a different type of foul play involved. But let's keep going here. In the Ripper series, police resources were stretched to the maximum, and even that effort proved to be wholly unsuccessful. The Ripper was never caught in the act, and it should be recalled that, for the most part, the Ripper killed on the streets and alleys of the East End. This, of course, increased the possibility of being caught. It also increased the thrill of the hunt. The Torso Killer never killed where the bodies were found and could have easily and exclusively been hiding himself. He also could have killed inside his preferred location, which seems to have moved around even a bit as he stayed in the general area of the East End. Some of the victims even had their bedclothes still hanging from the torsos, or the bodies were wrapped in them. The Torso Killer seemed to have had more resources and greater mobility than the Ripper. Did he also keep track of the Ripper? Did he also write any of the Ripper letters? And was he responsible for some of the Ripper deaths? The record is silent on these questions, at least for now, but the overlap is all a real possibility. And even though this is going to be a book that is going to be talking about a specific suspect, the Thames Torso Murders of Victorian London by R. Michael Gordon, he's going to talk about a specific suspect named George Chapman, who he believes was both killers. It actually sounds like he is bringing up some very strong points about how this could be two separate killers. Very different reasons why they kill, or very different methods that they use to handle the bodies. He brought up a possible alternative about the Thames Torso Killer, that these aren't even murders, it's almost just like someone who has some type of wrongdoing and they're trying to hide bodies for a different reason. Maybe not even a serial killer. If you're going to entertain the possibility of a different type of murderer, here's one that I would also like to throw to you. Somebody who murdered women because of an organized crime reason, and then they had an enforcer dismember the bodies and throw them in the Thames or at Pension Street. No, I don't endorse that theory. No, that's not my go-to theory. I'm just sharing something because I read this in R. Michael Gordon's book, and I'm putting it out to you. I'm trying to give some type of credence to this theory because I do not think that it should be immediately dismissed that there are alternative explanations in the Thames Torso case. But can I also ask you guys some questions? Does the geography of the land bother you? That the Thames Torso Killer is more expansive? Do the actions of the Torso Killer suggest that he had a different occupation than the Ripper? Does this show that he has privacy and the Ripper did not? And also, what if the Ripper is somebody who is rather poor and destitute, who's just roaming about? Well, if I can answer one question, I'm not convinced at all that they had different style occupations solely based on what we have from the victims. Dismembered bodies and torsos, arms cut apart. That doesn't immediately suggest to me that they had a different style of occupation or that they were of different social classes or that one had a bigger income than the other. That is what we call insufficient information. And, really it is. There could very well be a very similar economic standard that they both lived around. But I want to know what you guys think. Put your ideas in the comments section down below. And I have one final follow-up from last week's episode, and that is that I did an episode on the murder of Elizabeth Jackson because I wanted to do one on every named victim in this terrible series of homicides, but I felt it was only appropriate to mention every person and have their own standalone episode. Yes, it's like a memorial, but it's also just recognizing that this person, is an integral part of the story. And my episode on Elizabeth Jackson started out very slowly, where I was talking about her in a very genuine way, and then it all just turned into these types of things about the Thames Torso Killer and Jack the Ripper and doing a comparing and contrasting, which I've done in this episode as well. And I just want to say, rest in peace to Elizabeth Jackson. I perhaps should have said that 4 or 5 or 6 times more in my episode that I did about her. But I would love to know what you guys think. And this is, the name of the book is Thames Torso Murders of Victorian London by R. Michael Gordon. Perhaps it'll be worked into some future episodes of Black Box Online Radio. And today is Wednesday, right? Ripper Wednesday. But tomorrow I will be releasing a new episode for Dahlia Thursday. I've started a regular segment about the Black Dahlia here on Black Box Online Radio. That's the murder of Elizabeth Short from 1947. So if you're curious about that case, feel free to tune in. Very similar to the Thames Torso killer, even more so than Jack the Ripper, because in both instances you have a victim that was transported, that was dismembered, that was cut apart to a certain extent, as well as most likely there was a type of sexual gratification that the killer got the from the crime, and I do believe that about the Thames Torso murders. And I know I was just trying to wrap up the episode, but I do think that we need to reinforce this. As of now, if there were motives that were presented for the Thames Torso killings, I would say, number one, I would think that the primary motivation is, yes, some type of sexually motivated serial killer, a lone wolf who lured women to a place. He was dealing with some type of stimulation. He actually got gratification from murdering the women and cutting their bodies apart. Very similar to Jack the Ripper. That would be my top theory. The second and third would be something to the effect of, this is an enforcer for organized crime. That would probably be third. Second, I would say that this is somebody like an illegal doctor and just something went wrong because he was using very, very unethical operations on women, and he was doing this for who knows what reason. So number one would be sexually motivated serial killer, number two would be unethical medical doctor, and number three would be an enforcer for some type of organized crime. It would have to be an enforcer with an extremely strong amount of either medical knowledge or experience in this. I think that that's a little bit more unlikely. But I'm glad we could do that basic recap. And feel free to tune in to Dahlia Thursday here on Black Box Online Radio. You can also listen to content that comes out Monday through Friday here on BBO War. One more time, hit the like button and subscribe if you want to follow along with these shows. On Monday, I talk about the Zodiac Killer. On Tuesdays, about the case of Jean-Benet Ramsey. On Wednesdays, Ripper Wednesday, which you have right now. On Thursdays, about the Black Dahlia, Dahlia Thursday. And on Fridays, about D.B. Cooper. So lots of true crime content and unsolved mysteries. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88. And that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. That's all for me now, and see you tomorrow for a new episode on the Black Dahlia. Until next time.